Welcome, Traceable Designers. Today we're making the beautiful long pleated side panels. These panels can be hung with any of the Traceable Designer swag center panel styles. You can use the pleated design with the connector panels, or you can use one of the gathered styles. The gathered styles then are adjusted between the side panels for a perfect custom fit. Once you've made your side panels, make sure you make your selection for your center panel and follow the video tutorial for the instructions. You will need your straight swag side panel design form. This includes two pocket sizes. We're using the wider pocket size so we can fit through the pleats. With this design, we're also going to pick two fabrics, a front and a back, and then we're going to size that fabric for the design form. You will see the back fabric on the pleats. A lot of the cotton fabric sizes are 45 inches wide, so the design form will just barely fit to make the two side panels at one time. If you want something that's a little bit wider, you will need to make the panels individually for the left and the right side, and to do that you're simply going to flip your design form over to make the other side. If you are using a fabric with a print on the front, you're going to have to make sure that you cut those properly because both right sides will face each other and then they'll be turned the other direction. Make sure your lining is wide enough or that you purchase enough to be able to fit. You are going to be making a rod pocket, and making sure you have plenty of space for the pleated design is really important. You'll see two arrow marks on the side of your design panel. So what you're going to do is cut a very straight edge on the top and then just simply lower your design form down to mark the rod pocket height. This is where you will begin with your fusible tape. This example is for individual side panels, and I will be reversing the form to make the left side panel. So this fabric has a little seam edge. You don't want to include that because you don't want to see that on the outside when you turn it. So just follow along the lower edge of your design form, tracing along the edge all the way down to the corner or to the bottom curve, and then around to the side. And then if you did need to make a straight side up the side, you would then just trace the design form. Next, you're going to trace underneath on the straight inner area. If you want to add width, if your sizing for your window requires a little bit of extra width to the panel, just simply slide the form over and then trace the additional width on your panel and then up the side of the panel. So once you've completed your sizing, then you'll trace your outside right edge of the design form to mark the width, and then just simply slide the design form up to the top of the straight edge and complete tracing across the side. That will give you your width cut line. If you discover your panel is not straight on top, then simply just trace across the top to mark the panel height cut line. To cut out your side panel, just follow your trace line. Try to keep it as straight as possible. Follow underneath and then up to the straight edge on the inner side of the design form. And if you added any width to the inside edge, make sure you cut along that line as well. And then straight up to the top of the fabric section. If you did have excess fabric along the long edge of the design form, or you did have to trace the left side of the design form, then go ahead and follow that line as well to cut that nice and straight. To cut out your lining, you want to make sure it's the proper direction. You cannot use the design form the same direction for the same side. So you will need both of the right sides of the fabric together. So you'll need to reverse your design form in order to cut the lining so that they match up. So when you are doing your lining, you want to make sure that it's nice and straight across the top. The top of the design form is the lining top line, and then you need to add excess around all the edges. When you do attach the lining to the fabric, it needs to have excess for movement. So when you place it on top and you start to fuse, you want to make sure that everything is completely covered. So when you follow along, make sure you're adding an inch, inch and a half to all of the edges of the lining when you're doing your sizing. So just follow your trace line like you did with the front fabric and just cut out your lining for the back of your panel. Now, if you were making these on a folded fabric edge, you would make them with the fabric folded in half, and that would give you left and right side panels, so you would have the match on both sides. Once your lining has been cut out, just position right sides together on top of each other. You will align your lining at the height line for the pocket. So in other words, you're just going to be fusing your lining where the fusible tape will end. This way you don't fuse your pocket together. That can't receive any of the fusible backing. So you should have plenty of excess around the edges, so just double check that before you begin. Pull out your design form again and position it over your fabric section, again along the top edge. Double check your rod pocket depth, and then just slide the design form down and mark where the fusible backing will begin. Your kit does include the seam tape, the fusible seam tape, so pull that out, and we're going to use that along the seams of the fabric beginning at the rod pocket line. Make absolutely certain that you're fusing on the front side of the fabric, not the back, and then position your fusible seam tape along the edge. Don't overlap onto the ironing board. Make sure you have no steam. Turn the steam off and do a medium-high heat, and then just slowly follow along. Do not overheat your seam tape because it will deactivate the glue. So you'll continue along the side of your panel, positioning the seam tape right along the edge, inside of the edge, all the way down to the lower curved edge. And then once you reach that curved edge, you can cut that tape off, and then we're going to proceed around the curved edge using sections of tape. So you'll position the first piece, and then when it starts to curve, just peel that off, turn it again, and continue around the edge. You can peel it and move it as often as you like, usually about 3 pieces, and then continue up the side. And as you can see, the seam tape does straighten out your edge. So you'll continue around the entire piece of fabric up into the corner, making sure your corners are nice and straight, and then you'll continue up the inside section or the inside edge of the panel. Make sure you cut the tape before you fuse over the rod pocket section. You can always double check with the design form. Once the tape has completely cooled, just pull it off carefully. If anything is left behind, make sure you peel it to make sure all the paper is off from the backing, and this will expose the glue on the seam. Try not to overlap or fold the fabric because the glue sections can stick together. Once you've removed all the paper, then reposition your lining with the front sides together. Make sure the outside seams are completely covered, so you're going to want to make sure the excess goes along the edges. And very important, you want to align your lining with the top of the glue on each side. Make sure that you double check that because that needs to be fused. And then you can just check the center part to make sure that it's nice and straight along the rod pocket. So very important, begin in the middle with a sweeping motion out toward the ends. What you're doing is you're making sure you flatten all of the fabric and it does not buckle. So you don't want to fuse the edge seams until everything has been flattened. So continue with a center out motion and then along the seam and then pulling the iron toward you. And then once you've gotten everything completely flat and straight, then you can carry on along the seam a second time. Once everything is fused, flip your fabric over, and then you're just going to carefully cut off the excess. You can see we left plenty of excess for the shifting of the fabric. So follow along the line and carefully just remove all of the excess lining that's exposed on the back. This will make it easier when you turn the fabric. It won't be buckled. Once all the excess is removed, we're just going to snip off a little piece of the corner. This is going to help when you turn the fabric, and then you'll put a couple snips in the indent on the inside. And make sure you do not cut through the seam or you will have a hole. So just a couple of little snips will help that turn more carefully. Then you're going to take your time to turn the fabric right side out, and then you'll just press carefully in the corners to flatten everything out. You want to make sure not to press through. You have to make completely certain that the glue is cooled before you begin this process, and if you do happen to poke through or something didn't seal quite right, just use the iron to correct it. So take your time straightening out the fabric. You're going to turn it completely around, getting all the corners, and then when you've got that completed, then we're going to fuse it from the back side first to get everything nice and flat. So once that's finished, turn it over with the back side facing out, and then we'll start fusing the corners. So for this process, just take your time. You can see where the fabric grabs. Eventually it does flatten out. So you'll just keep checking your seams, and if you need to stick your hand inside and make the corners a little bit more sharp, you can do that, or pull the fabric to make it flatten. What you're doing is you're just making a nice straight seam from the back to the front on your fabric, and just keep sweeping up so that you flatten everything out. So take your time, move around the corners and adjust it, and then eventually everything will be nice and flat so that you can begin to make your pleats. To finish, just turn the fabric with the front side facing up and then run the iron over the valance section again along the corners to make sure it's all nice and straight. So now we need to secure the lining so it doesn't sag. Pull out your seam tape. You're going to put seam tape behind all of the open seams, one on each side of the panel and then across the back of the lining. But when you put your seam tape in, you want to make sure it's 100% hidden. You don't want anything exposed at all. If there's any open glue there, it will prevent your pocket from closing. So insert your seam tape, make sure that it's completely covered. I usually warm it first to put it in place and then open the seam to finish it. Do both sides, make sure that it's all hidden behind the seam. And then you're going to straighten your fabric. It's really important that you pull your fabric up so it's nice and straight. Don't skip this step, because that will actually get rid of all of the buckles, so you have a nice crisp flat piece of fabric with the lining secured on the back. Then insert the tape behind the lining. You don't want that to expose at all beyond the edges, so do a double check with that. Again, straighten your fabric. Then usually you should run the iron on top of the fabric to get that to start to glue down. Then you can lift and fuse behind. But even at this point, it still can move. So make sure that it is hidden behind the fabric before you complete. So then get everything nice and straight, peel off the tape once it's cooled, and then before you actually fuse the seams down, make sure that they're covering the exposed glue. So do another double check on that before you fuse that down. Do both sides, and then do the lining section. When you get to the lining section, you're going to, again, for a final time, smooth out the lining from the bottom up before you use your iron. Then when you use your iron, you're going to flatten that all out. So remove your tape, make sure everything's nice and flat, and then just fuse your lining in place. Your design form shows spacing for your pleats. You're going to make 3 pleats. They're about 1.5 inches apart. So you're just going to adjust your panels until it matches about 11 inches. So you'll just keep readjusting until it works, until it matches, unless of course you've added width to your panel, then they'll be a little bit wider. Once they're in place, just iron them to flatten. Make sure they're nice and straight. Your kit does include fusible backing. This is used to make wider sections for your pleats. You're just going to cut pieces that will fit behind. Usually they're about an inch, a little under an inch wide. So you'll just cut 3 strips and you'll position those behind the pleats. These need to be hidden 100% behind the pleats, and they can't stick out below where the curves are. So double check your pleats if they're sticking out at all. If they're extending past the edges, then you're just going to cut those down to make those fit. So just insert the strips behind the panels. You want to make sure they're all the way up to the top edge, because that's going to hold your rod pocket together. So make sure that they go all the way to the top edge. They don't actually have to be the full length of the pleat, but they do need to be at the top edge. So once those have all been inserted, then you're just going to fuse those in place. So you'll lift it up and you'll just put your iron inside to fuse them. But you can see here where it's extending past the edge. You'll cut that angle to make sure that you cannot see that once that's fused. So carefully use your iron, lift the panels, and fuse inside to get all of your fusible backing secured. Then once the paper has completely cooled, just go ahead and peel all of the strips off to expose the glue. Then you're simply going to reposition the pleats back nice and straight, making sure that they're covering all of the exposed glue, and then just use your iron to run over the pleats to make sure that they're fused. Now you do have several layers of fabric here, so it's going to take a while to fuse, and you want to make sure you don't burn your fabric. So pull out a piece of spare lining and lay it over top of the fabric. This way you'll be able to press and put the exposed heat for longer periods of time to hold them together without burning your fabric. You do need to use a little bit of pressure to get these to hold, and then just push down with the piece of lining to hold them in place. Let everything cool completely before you reverse your panel to do the back side. Follow the exact same process on the back. On the back though, you want to make sure that you are fusing up near the rod pocket area, so make sure those are all completely fused before you move on to making your rod pocket. Also, do not lift the panel or try to do anything with it until everything is cooled. To make your rod pocket, you're going to turn your panel over and you're just going to fold the fabric section over to meet the top edge of the lining. You don't want to overlap onto the lining. Leave a little space here and then just get it started with the iron. Cut a piece of fusible backing that fits inside of the rod pocket area but does not extend onto your ironing board, and then just fuse that down. Once it's completely cooled, peel back the paper and then carefully fold your pocket over onto the back of the lining and then fuse your pocket in place. This does take a while. You've got a lot of layers of folded fabric. Make sure that you use the lining on top to really hold that in place, and you'll have to press to put the pressure to get the heat through, and then leave it alone until it's completely cooled, and then just slip your rod right through the pocket. Once you've finished both side panels, move on to a selection for your center panels. You can choose between the pleated or the gathered designs. Watch the video tutorial to follow along for your center panels as well. Thank you for joining me, Traceable Designers, and remember, you can always make your mark with Traceable Designer.